It is basic math. If we want to protect democracy, we need to expand the number of seats in play. Marina Jenkins of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Marina Jenkins, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thank you for having me, Marc. It's great to see you.
All right, Marina, we're going to talk a lot about redistricting, but before we get to that, there has been a lot of news out of the Department of Justice as Harmeet Dillon has taken over the Civil Rights Division that oversees voting, and we have seen all kinds of terribleness ensue. What is your take on that situation, the fact that DOJ is withdrawing from cases, the fact that Harmeet Dillon seems to want to turn the department into something that is unrecognizable from voting rights? What's your overall take on that?
It's terrible. My hot take. It's bad. I think that there's a distinction that needs to be made, which is, there is some element of normalcy in that we've seen from administration to administration, there's some expectation, right? That the way that the Department of Justice engages in cases, from the Solicitor General office to offices across the department, there's some expectation, right? That they're going to reassess where they are. They're going to change course in some places. They're going to stay the course in others. I think what we're seeing in the Civil Rights Division specifically is just a really disastrous devastation of this office, of this, team of lawyers that have for decades, been incredibly effective at fighting for the rights of Americans across the country on a number of different issues. And it's just so far beyond, what we might expect to see in terms of that kind of case analysis. And then, maybe there's some shift, but this is, an all-out assault on the civil rights of Americans through the sort of, just destruction of this division.
Yeah. So this obviously cuts across a lot of different issues. It cuts across voting rights cases, traditional right to vote cases. It also affects redistricting cases. You obviously run the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. So I'm going to ask you about how it affects that work. But before I do, we have seen the aggressive use of the courts by Republicans, by your counterpart organization. I forget their name, but it's, evil Republicans,
doesn't matter,
gerrymandering or whatever it is. But also Republicans, the Republican National Committee, Republican candidates. And in my view, one of the most shameful and the most dangerous of those is currently going on in North Carolina. And so, though that is not a redistricting case, it is actually a judicial election in which Allison Riggs, the Democratic justice, won that election by 700 and some odd votes. There was a recount, she won it. There was a second partial recount, she won it. And now you see the Republican candidate there, really just doing everything they can to try to overturn that election. Talk a little bit about what you worry about, because I know you all were also involved heavily in the Wisconsin judicial election in supporting the progressive candidate there. And you saw Elon Musk spend $1 gazillion there. Talk about what it means that we see the Republican Party and the Republican, infrastructure so engaged on the other side of the work you do and the other work that civil rights groups are doing.
Yeah. The North Carolina situation is so alarming. What's happening there is ultimately a brazen attempt to overturn an election by changing the rules after the fact, right? And so Justice Allison Riggs, was elected in November by 734 votes. Not the tightest election, not the tightest Supreme Court election in North Carolina.
Not the tightest at all. I can tell you that.
At all. But close. And so, appropriately, there were recounts. There were multiple levels of recounts, and consistently, the North Carolina Board of Elections and courts found, this is the victor. Justice Allison Riggs kept her seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. But then you have a sitting judge come in and challenge over 60,000 votes for, reasons that he is kind of, cherry picking in terms of, oh, well, these folks didn't have something in their records. There's no accusation or allegation that any voter did anything wrong.
No.
It's just, oh, I don't like the way, this happened. And so I'm going to challenge it. And, awful the way that they're doing it, in fact, more specifically, because he's attacking military and overseas voters. So folks who are serving our country, and he's saying, oh, no, your votes should presumptively be questioned because, you're overseas. And so, it's really alarming. And I think it really exhibits the extent to which Republicans are going to challenge elections where they don't like the outcomes. And to your point about, the connection with redistricting, part of why these state Supreme Courts have become so important is, one, the US Supreme Court has decided it's not going to engage on partisan gerrymandering cases. It has also now recently decided that it's going to kick, cases about women's health and reproductive health back to states. There are so many issues that are now being litigated and worked out in these state Supreme Courts. And Republicans know that they can't win elections fairly, so they're trying to cheat because that's their game plan.
Yeah. So I now want to turn to redistricting. I got my free questions answered about voting rights with you, but your expertise is really around redistricting. And for people who don't know, as I mentioned in the introduction, you run the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is the premier organization for redistricting. There are affiliated 501c3s and C4s. But what people need to realize is that if you care about fair districts and you want to make sure that Democratic voters are protected in that process, you want to be supporting the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. There's an alphabet soup of Democratic organizations, everyone, and I know it's sometimes people are looking for one-stop shopping, but it's Marina's organization that is really doing the yeoman's work there. So I want to talk to you and start at kind of a very high level, then we'll get into some of the specific states. So, there's a lot of cynicism, you may say justified cynicism, you may say less justified in some instances, but a lot of cynicism around the redistricting process and whether Democrats are doing well, Republicans are screwing Democrats, we have rigged maps, we have fair maps. I mean, there's just a lot of information. I think you may say it depends a little bit on the state, but how do you all, taking a 80,000 foot view, how would you describe to someone out there listening the current state of affairs as it relates to, let's just take Congress, because that's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough to start with.
Yeah, the current state of affairs for redistricting is actually incredibly good. The congressional map right now is the fairest it has been in decades. The New York Times, after the 2022 election, said it was the fairest map in a generation. And so, we're in a really good place. And a lot of this success has happened since our organization was founded, since the NDRC was founded in 2017. We've been able to move to this place where in states across the country, there are competitive maps and the will of the voter is being realized. What we saw in the 2024 elections in Congress, this kind of was missed in a lot of the headlines about, just how poorly Democrats did and, what was happening at the top of the ticket. And, but the truth of the matter is actually the congressional votes match the representation that we have right now as closely as they have ever. And, the phrase that the New York Times uses, fairest maps in a generation. But if you think about the fact that the Voting Rights Act amendments of 1982 really put us into even what could conceivably be considered fair at all, we have the fairest maps we've ever had as a country ever, which doesn't mean that we're done. And it doesn't mean that there isn't so much work to be done. There are a lot of states, as you noted, that redistricting is a state-by-state issue. It's a patchwork of process and laws from state to state. And so looking at the map, there are still a lot of places where congressional and state legislative maps are gerrymandered. We're still fighting in a lot of states, in Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia. The fight goes on in North Carolina. We're working in Wisconsin. There is so much more work to do because, we are now in this era of perpetual redistricting. This is no longer a moment where, we sort of think about redistricting once every 10 years and then put it to bed until we're ready for it again. This is really work that has to happen all the time for us to make that progress and keep it.
Yeah. And so, in full disclosure, my law firm and I do work for NDRC, but the credit goes to Marina and her team on these victories. But one of the things I always say, and I'm curious how you experience it, is that for all of the skepticism and rightful skepticism about the U.S. Supreme Court, for all of the problems that we all see with our own eyes about feeling like the Supreme Court is failing democracy, in the redistricting arena, actually, you guys have had a number of pretty significant victories. It was not that long ago that people were predicting that the independent state legislature theory, which would essentially take state courts out of that arena, was going to sweep through the U.S. Supreme Court, and NDRC and its affiliates were represented. Actually, the named plaintiff, or I guess by the time it got to the Supreme Court, maybe the named respondent, but Becky Harper in Moore v. Harper, and that was a victory. You've had successes in Alabama and Louisiana, and we're going to drill into each of those. But why do you think that, beyond the excellent lawyering, why do you think that the Supreme Court in the redistricting arena has been particularly, sort of sympathetic to at least some of the kinds of claims that you and NDRC bring?
Yeah, we do have exceptional lawyering, including the Elias Law Group and also our chairman, Attorney General Eric Holder. We have an incredible team. And the truth of the matter is we bring cases that we know we can and should win. And I think there are a lot of questions right now about the judiciary and what it looks like, and can it withstand what's happening, and what's happening with the rule of law. And our theory of the case has always been, if you bring a case where you're right on the facts, you're right on the law, and you should win, you should win. And so, certainly oftentimes personnel on a court is going to rule the day. The ideological perspective of a particular judge or set of judges may rule the day. But more often than not, when you bring a case and you're certain that the facts and the law go together and you should win, that's where we should be. And, these are not cases that we are trying to do something new and ask the Supreme Court to impose new laws. There a lot of the accusations that you see thrown around is that, we're trying to, ask judges to be activists, and we're, looking to sue until things are blue, or whatever the phrases that they use. But the truth of the matter is we are trying to enforce the law, and particularly in a moment when the Department of Justice is being gutted and the Civil Rights Division has been gutted, it is that much more important for organizations like ours and law firms like yours to keep fighting and to keep pushing in the direction of enforcement of our civil rights laws, which at the end of the day should not be controversial, should not be a partisan issue. In fact, for decades, the Voting Rights Act, enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, was not a partisan issue. It was reauthorized, signed by President Bush, right? Like, this is something that used to be something we could all agree on. And hopefully someday it will be again.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Marina in a moment. But if you value Democracy Docket's work and want to support the team's efforts to bring you the latest voting rights and democracy news, please become a premium member today. You'll get access to exclusive newsletters, contents, events, and more. Sign up at the link above or in the description below. You mentioned Eric Holder, who chairs the organization. One of the things about him and about you and about the entire team, because obviously it's not just the two of you, there's a large number of folks on your team behind it. But one of the things that I've always admired and I've spoken out about, and that people who watch this should know about them, is, um, you know, Eric Holder is not afraid to bring a lawsuit. uh if he think, like you said, if he thinks we're right on the law and on the facts, like he's right, he's game for bringing the case.
Yeah.
And I find, I've been involved in a number of public spats on this with people who see the world otherwise.
Yeah.
That he doesn't view the purpose of these laws to stay in books in dusty corners of shelves. He believes, as you say, in enforcing the law. And I think that is really to your credit and to his credit, and has proven successful in this arena. And I want to focus on two particular cases, or two particular states, maybe, which is Alabama and Louisiana, and talk about, I would argue that not only have you all been successful there, but you had in both states Black voters who were suffering a real harm in not being fairly represented. Their federal civil rights had been violated, and taking those fights on, and what that meant to you as someone who runs this organization, to Eric Holder, not that you speak on his behalf, but like talk about the importance of those cases, not just legally, but like to the what it means to be enforcing the Voting Rights Act in the 2020s.
Yeah, it's so important to us as an organization. The organization was founded in 2017. I came on board towards the end of that year, and this was the first thing we decided to do. From a litigation perspective, there are laws on the books that are not being enforced, specifically in the South, but across the country. And for us, it was looking at the landscape. At the time, you remember 2017, there were new groups left, right, and center. Well, mostly on the left, but there were new groups, popping up all over the place. And it was really important to us to make sure we were adding value in that moment, and to make sure that we were not showing up and popping up as a new organization and trying to repeat what anybody else has done. But we identified this real deficit, which was that the Voting Rights Act at the time, and pieces of it still today, is still good law. And so, I think today a lot of folks talk about, not acquiescing in advance, right? Not, sort of giving up in advance. And I think if in the moment when we looked at the law and said, if we have this law is good law, and we're not using it, then you are giving up in advance. You're sort of giving up your power and the rights to say, this community deserves representation and they deserve to have their votes not diluted. And that right is protected under this law. And we should bring these lawsuits to make sure that that those rights are being vindicated.
Yeah. So you guys had, like I said, success. Those days also in Georgia. I should add another example. There is a case that is pending, or that has been argued, that we are waiting for out of Louisiana.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could tell folks a little bit about that case and what they should be waiting to hear, not necessarily predicting the outcome, but like what are the stakes, and what is the court kind of up to?
So the case that is currently under consideration by the Supreme Court is a Section 2 case utilizing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act out of Louisiana. And it started when the National Redistricting Foundation and a number of other organizations brought lawsuits back in 2022 seeking to have fair representation for Black voters in Louisiana. And what we were seeking were 2 seats, 2 congressional districts where Black voters have the opportunity to elect their candidates of choice, which is what is protected under Section 2, and that those rights needed to be, the vindication of those rights needed to be remedied by a new map that had 2 Black opportunity seats where there had been only one. And we litigated that case over years, and the district court ultimately found in our favor. And there is a new map that was used this past November that had 2 opportunity districts for Black voters in Louisiana. And what happened? Within a week, almost immediately after the new map was passed, a group of self-proclaimed non-African American voters filed a new lawsuit against the map that had just been passed. And they filed it in a super conservative court in the Western District of Louisiana, in Shreveport, Louisiana, even though we'd been litigating in the Middle District of Louisiana for years. And instead of trying to get into that case and argue their perspective there, they brought this new case in this conservative court, right? And so they say, oh, no, this map is a violation of the Constitution because it's a racial gerrymander, because it provides these Black opportunity districts. And so what the Supreme Court now has to decide is, how do the 14th Amendment's equal protections and Voting Rights Act Section 2, how do those two things work together? Are they in conflict? And, certainly we are of the opinion that they are not in conflict, that the Voting Rights Act does not violate the Equal Protection Clause, if anything. And actually, we very much believe strongly that the Voting Rights Act enforces
Exactly.
the 14th Amendment, right?
Which the 14th Amendment says it gives Congress enforcement authority.
Right. These are civil rights, these are civil rights amendments that were passed to, at the end of slavery to make sure that these communities, that Black voters in the South could have equal civil rights. And so the Voting Rights Act is trying to enforce that. And now you have these voters, non-African American voters, they're white voters coming in and saying, no, you don't get to have that. And you get a conservative court saying, oh yeah, I think that's right. And so, I think what the Supreme Court is going to decide is how we move forward and how do you ensure that voters' rights are protected, and that, whether or not they are going to chip away even more than they already have at the Voting Rights Act, which will be Chief Justice Roberts' legacy, or, do they protect this law that's the crown jewel of the civil rights movement?
Which they did. In fairness, I rarely say this, in fairness to Chief Justice Roberts. In fairness to Chief Justice Roberts, in the Alabama case that you all brought and won in the U.S. Supreme Court, again, a lot of people thought they'd chip away at the Voting Rights Act. They didn't. They upheld the 2 Black districts there.
Yeah. The Milligan decision was an incredible win.
The Alabama decision.
Yes. The Alabama decision, the decision was called Allen v. Milligan. It was an incredible win. And the Alabama litigation was very similar to Louisiana from what I described, starting with a map that only provided 1 Black opportunity district in a state that has 7 seats, where the population of Black voters in Alabama is such that actually they should have 2 of such districts, 2 districts where Black voters have the opportunity to elect their preferred candidates. And the district court agreed. And it was, a panel of 3 judges, and including 2 Trump judges, wrote a 250-page decision on a preliminary injunction motion back in 2022. I guess the case started 2021, and then, we get this decision in early 2022. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court faltered a bit and issued a stay. So we weren't able to use that map in 2022. But in 2023, on full consideration of the case, the Supreme Court agreed and said, yes, on a direct application of all of these facts and application of law that has not changed significantly in decades, that this is straightforward. This is a straightforward textbook application of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And there was nothing to really, there was no sort of funny business for them to do with it. And in fact, in that decision, they swatted away this idea that the Voting Rights Act is in conflict with the 14th Amendment. And so if in the Louisiana case that they're going to decide this spring, they come to a different conclusion, that will be a a whiplash of a reversal from this court on the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. So look, the fact is, as Marina said, the the after the Civil War, Congress and the passed the 14th Amendment, which and the 15th Amendment, which gives Congress itself the ability and the right to effectuate voting rights for Black citizens. At that point, Black men, now all Black men and women. It gave them the right to enforce that through appropriate legislation. Congress exercised that right in passing the Voting Rights Act. In 1982, Ronald Reagan signed a strengthening of the Voting Rights Act. Ever since then, the Supreme Court has issued opinion after opinion after opinion under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, as it relates to redistricting. And as recently as a couple of years ago in Alabama, it did. And so, as Marina is saying, for them to now somehow decide that because these white voters in Louisiana came along, that they have discovered something that has heretofore never been accepted. It's been, by the way, those arguments have been made before. And it's never been accepted. That's something we all need to be following and making sure that doesn't happen. But Marina, I want to turn now to kind of what I'll call the future, 2026, 2028, and also, believe it or not, the next census in 20
right around the corner
in 2030. So let's first start with what I'll call the 2026, 2028. Sure. What are the places that people should be looking at for potential on the ground activity, judicial elections, organizing, maybe litigation, either ongoing or potential in the future? Like where are the redistricting battles that we should be looking at if we're smart looking forward?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We have a 10-year plan. We are we take a long-term view on this. We are looking ahead to the census. We are looking ahead to 2032, believe it or not, and what that's going to look like. But, in the next several years, there are so many important things happening. Litigation remains ongoing. The National Redistricting Foundation, along with our partners and working with your team at the Elias Law Group, we still have 5 lawsuits across the country. There are cases beyond the ones that our team is bringing. There's a case in Utah. We still have litigation in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, still fighting those fights, even though we talked about the wins that we've had there. Similar in Georgia, still working on an appeal. We're waiting on a decision from the Florida Supreme Court on a challenge there. There is we talked about this incredibly important ongoing fight in North Carolina, but lo and behold, we're still fighting for Justice Riggs for her seat, and also starting to look ahead to 2026 when Justice Anita Earls will be up for re-election. That's an incredibly important seat that we also need to save. This fall, we've got 3 Supreme Court seats in Pennsylvania that need to be protected. There are all 100. 3 in Pennsylvania.
Jeez.
3 in Pennsylvania, I know. And then Wisconsin is up again. We just celebrated the victory of Susan Crawford, Judge Susan Crawford, who will be now Justice Susan Crawford in Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court has elections every spring between now and 2028. So, we'll be there every spring, making sure that Wisconsin maintains its, pro-democracy majority that it has right now. Due to the amazing work of so many of our partners. And that's something we've been really personally, very, very invested in as an organization since our founding. We've got all sorts of things happening. There's a governor's race in Virginia. There's one in New Jersey as well. There's 100 House seats up in Virginia. Another day I'll come back and talk to you about why we think, Virginia needs new redistricting reform.
Amen. As a Virginia resident and someone who has litigated redistricting in Virginia, Marina, I am 100% with you on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So and then we turn to 2026, and we've already, started plotting out what needs to happen then. We're getting to the point where a lot of the people who are going to be elected now are going to be in decision-making positions. We're already there. So, the redistricting work happens all throughout the decade. So we don't stop. But it's incredibly important. And I think particularly in a moment when what's happening at the federal level is so distressing and really, really awful. I think, it's that much more important to focus on what we're able to do in the states and the ways that we're able to secure pro-democracy majorities in state legislatures, on state Supreme Courts, in governors' mansions. We need to make sure we are protecting democracy at the state level, understanding that we will also be simultaneously fighting for it at the federal level. But this is the backstop that we have, is that we have this republic, we have this system where the states are just as important, and we're working to make sure that they hold strong.
So a lot of people who are watching this will ask, because they write into Democracy Docket regularly, and I get this question all the time. They're very worried about what Donald Trump is doing, obviously, for good reason. And they know the census is coming up, and they also see what Doge is doing. And and so people are worried, like, are you worried about the 2030 census? Like, is Doge attacking it? Is Donald Trump going to be able to do something in advance? Are the Republican AGs up to anything that's no good? Yeah. What do you have to say about the census in 2030?
Yeah. There's sort of two ways I'll answer this question. The first is the direct attack. And what we saw in 2019, 2020 during Trump's first term was an attack on the census by trying to introduce a citizenship question. Obviously, his attacks on immigrants are known to everybody. This is not a surprise that this is part of his agenda. And we've seen it before. And the reality is that the introduction of a citizenship question might seem non-controversial, but really, ultimately, what you're doing is chilling communities' desire to participate in our census. There's the reality that actually the Constitution says all persons must be counted.
Right.
So
citizen or not.
Right, citizen or not, it's just flatly you have to count everyone. And so this desire, and so they, there was a lawsuit that was brought that we're engaging with by a number of states, trying to say, well, non-citizens and even those here, legal residents should not be counted in the census. That's unconstitutional, period, end of story. But, they're trying to undermine the count so that either people are not being counted or you are, chilling people from participating. And that's the second piece of it, I think, in terms of what Doge is doing, the accessing people's data, the, making folks fearful of what the government might do with the information that they have about, that the government has about them. And so it's this general chilling effect of participating in government programs that rely and huge institutions. I mean, the census is one of the biggest things that our government takes on. It's one of the biggest projects that the federal government takes on every 10 years, and it takes years to prepare and to build it up, and then to execute. And it has incredibly important impacts, not only on representation but also on funding. And so the agenda of the administration to kind of try to make people afraid of participating with the government in any way also just has a significant chilling effect that we're worried about in terms of having a fair and accurate census in 2030 that will be successful and that will count all the people who live in our country, whether or not they are citizens, whether or not they are legal residents. They should be counted. They have to be counted according to our Constitution. And being able to reach that goal successfully will depend on getting these communities that have been harmed, that will continue to be harmed over the next several years, to trust, to sort of rebuild some of that trust into our institutions enough that they will raise their hand and say, yeah, I should be counted, which they should be.
They absolutely should be. So, look, the question that people will have watching this is, what can they do, right? People don't want to feel helpless. They want to feel like there's something they can do to engage. Obviously, they can go to your website. They can support you financially, and they ought to do that. If you care about democracy, you ought to check out the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Get on, by the way, get on their mailing list. You learn an awful
Yeah.
lot. I learn stuff on their mailing list like every day. So get on their mailing list, even if you don't support them, but don't want to financially support them, I should say. But what else can people do in our final moments here to support your work and the work of fair districting more generally?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I will say, in addition to all the things you mentioned, which you should do, our website is democraticredistricting.com. We have a grassroots organization, a campaign called All on the Line. Folks can go to allontheline.org to figure out how to get plugged in. You can text democracy to 36787 to join the National Democratic Redistricting Committee's movement. We are an organization that is entirely dependent on the community of folks concerned about these issues with us. And, as I mentioned, redistricting is a state-by-state patchwork. And so we really, just rely on folks from all over the country being locked in with us, telling us, how best to work in their state, communicating with us and supporting us to make sure that folks across the country have fair representation. And, from a Democratic perspective, AG Holder always says, if we have fair maps and there's equal competition, there's fair competition between Democrats and Republicans, Democrats and progressives are going to do just fine. All we need is an equal playing field.
Well, there you have it, everybody. We put the links to all of that in the description below. Marina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters to stay informed on the latest voting rights and democracy news. We'll see you next time.